Introduction. It's nice to know that I'm normal. I think I want to speak for about 15 minutes. Is that right? On the Employment Rights Bill. The Employment Rights Bill, of course, should be the bright, shining star of Labour Party policy, particularly when you compare it to the winter fuel allowance, the two-child limit, the WASPy women, the policy on Gaza, and last week, of course, the policy on immigration. But it's not quite as bright and shiny as you might like it to be. The government have always said that it's the biggest upgrade in workers' rights for a generation. And in saying that, they're probably right. In fact, they could have gone a bit further. It's probably the biggest upgrade in workers' rights since Harold Wilson in the 1970s introducing legislation. But the problem is, how do you judge a bill of this kind? If you judge it simply on, is it better than what we've got now after 14 years of Tory governments, after 45 years of neoliberal governments, then of course it's a great improvement. But if you judge it against the standard of the Labour Party policy that was adopted in 2021, a New Deal for working people, it falls far short. I should say I was the honorary legal advisor to the working group that drafted a New Deal for working people. I don't know how familiar you are with that document, but it's what Andy MacDonald, the chair of the working group, called the Green Paper, although it's printed in red. But it set out a really radical agenda to transform labour law in this country. I call it labour law because it's not just about employment, it's about trade unions and collective issues as well. 15 minutes, we haven't got time to go through it. This is the bill. I brought it along just to show you the size of it. That's it. 299 pages, that bill is. And at the moment, or this afternoon, we're on day 4 of consideration in the House of Lords. And this is the amendment document we've got to go through. And there are, I think, 148 pages of amendments to the bill. It's absolutely massive and hideously complicated. And one of the consequences of that is that very few people have actually read it. I'm probably amongst, dozen, maybe 2 dozen, maybe 100 people in this country that have actually read this bill from beginning to end. So most people are taking their view on the bill from somebody else who heard it from somebody else who read it somewhere. If you actually examine the bill, it shows the proposed legislation in a very different light. As I say, we haven't got time to go through the whole thing, but what I'd like to do is draw your attention to 3 things. First of all, I'm just going to deal with some preliminary points about the shape of the bill. Secondly, I'm going to speak about collective bargaining. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about the right to strike. So let's begin with some features of the bill itself. I've already mentioned its size and complexity, but there are other issues with it too. It focuses in particular on individual rights. Now, individual rights are all very well, particularly for lawyers. That's how they make their money, enforcing or defending against individual rights. But for workers, it's a different thing. If you've got a right that your employer has breached, what do you do about it? The only remedy you've got is to go to an employment tribunal. Well, tribunals are all very well, but the odds are stacked against you. If you look at the annual statistics, you see that most people who go to a hearing, whatever it's for, discrimination, unfair dismissal, underpayment of redundancy, holiday pay, or whatever, most people lose. Most people lose because of the way that the law is structured. But also, of course, there's the issue of when your case is going to be heard in the employment tribunal. I've spoken to colleagues in my barristers' chambers who are telling me that they've got cases listed now in 2027, not just next year or the year after, but 2027. There's a backlog of over 46,000 cases waiting to be heard in employment tribunals. And there are two other problems as well, just to bear in mind. One is that it costs money to go to the employment tribunal. True, the Tories' imposition of fees was swept away by the Supreme Court, but it nevertheless costs time and resources. Even if you're taking your own case, you've got to go to the library and look up the law, you've got to interview your witnesses, you've got to prepare all the documents for the case, witness statements and what have you. And if you want your union to represent you, then it is a cost to them, either cost in the time of the officials in preparing and presenting the case, or cost in hiring lawyers to do that job for the union. And the final problem I think is worth bearing in mind is this, that if a worker is successful in an employment tribunal, they will get a compensatory award. You can leave aside reinstatement orders. Reinstatement orders are as rare as hen's teeth. Less than 0.1% of cases in the employment tribunal result in a reinstatement order. Financial compensation is the best that you can hope for. But you look at the statistics and you find that 1/3 of the people who were awarded compensation by an employment tribunal were not paid that money at all. Another third were only paid part of the money, and only 1/3 actually received their full entitlement. And if you're not paid what you're entitled to, then you can take the case to the county court, where you've got all those problems that we mentioned earlier again. So I'm not against individual employment rights. Of course I'm not. We all want as many rights as we can get. And this bill does present some really useful things: bereavement leave, paternity leave, possibly pay as well. That's still being argued about. And various others, trade union right of access to premises to speak to members and non-members and so on. These are useful things, but it's not really what workers need at the moment. What workers need in the workplace, as I'm sure everybody here will agree, is power. That's what we want. We want more power at the workplace. And power at the workplace can only be achieved collectively. That's why I'm going to talk to you about collective bargaining and the right to strike, because they are the instruments, the age-old instruments by which workers through their trade unions have exerted power at the workplace. And that's what we need to be transformational about: rights to make trade unionism effective so that trade unions can properly represent their members and the working class as a whole. Now, there's one other thing that I wanted to mention to you by way of introduction in relation to this bill, and that's this, that the government promised that they would introduce legislation within 100 days of coming to office, and that they achieved. But I do ask myself, why on earth did you promise to do that? We could have waited. We've waited 45 years for a restoration of balance in our labour law. We could have waited another year, but the consequence of introducing this bill after 100 days has meant that it's many provisions in it are simply partial. What they do is to give the Secretary of State or the Minister power to introduce regulations to fill out whatever the right is that the bill is prescribing. And the Tories in the House of Lords have been complaining, look, it's all very well you're saying you're going to make regulations, but where are the regulations? We don't know what the regulations are going to say. And we can equally say it from our side as well. We just don't know. And it seems extremely unparliamentary, unconstitutional to introduce a bill and expect Parliament to vote on it if you haven't got the detail of what the effect of the laws are going to be written on the face of the bill in front of you. And the consequence of this is meant, instead of the normal process of introducing a bill, white paper, green paper, consultation, and then the bill, they're doing this one in reverse. We've got the bill, and now we're having the consultations. There are consultations going on at this minute. I got an invitation to join a working party with the Department of Business and Trade tomorrow on some, I can't remember what the subject is, but some part of the bill. And this is going on and on. And there are some major issues which the bill doesn't deal with, which a document which was published at the same time called Next Steps says will be dealt with in the future. One of them is the status of workers, which is to say, are you an employee or are you self-employed? Or are you what the lawyers call a limby worker, sort of in between? Or are you a worker of a one-person company, and so on? All that needs sorting out. I myself introduced 2 bills in the House of Lords to create a single status of worker plus genuine self-employed workers in business on their own account, of which there are unions represented here who represent significant numbers of, like film and TV technicians and so on, other categories as well. All that is being left into the future. But when you're handing out rights, you want to know which category of worker is entitled to the rights. We want all rights for all workers from day one, but that's not what we're going to get. So enough of a rant about the size and shape and format of the bill. There are other points we could deal with as well. We can do that in Q&A if there's time for that. Let's just move on to collective bargaining. One of the things that the New Deal for Working People, the foundational document adopted by the Labour Party conference in 2021, one of the things that it proposed was the introduction of sectoral collective bargaining in every sector of the economy. Now, sectoral collective bargaining, of course, is a very sexy term of art. What it means is collective bargaining between all the unions and all the employers or their associations in a given sector. And we used to have this across the British economy, not all of it, but most of it. We used to have it, whatever it was, agriculture, catering and hospitality, road services, and so forth and so on. We don't have it anymore, unfortunately. There are still a few electrical contracting and a couple of collective, sectoral collective agreements in parts of construction, and I think cardboard making as well. But for the most part, it's gone. And the consequence of the destruction of sectoral collective bargaining in this country has meant that the coverage of collective agreements has been significantly reduced. Between the end of the Second World War in 1945, which we just celebrate the 80th anniversary of the ending of, between 1945 and 1980, the coverage of collective agreements was 80% of British workers. 8 out of every 10 workers had the benefit of a collective agreement negotiated by a union or unions with employers in the sector. Probably not every term and condition, but most of them as a base layer. And on top of that, of course, in many sectors, there was enterprise collective bargaining on top, or collective bargaining with a particular employer to enhance the base sectoral rates. But that has now declined. We're now looking at less than a quarter of workers covered by a collective agreement, which means that 3/4 of our workforce, 34 million people, half the entire population of these islands, are at the mercy of the employer to set terms and conditions. Because as everybody in this room knows, one single worker has got no negotiating power at all. You go for a job, the employer tells you what the terms and conditions are, and you either take it or you leave it. It's as simple as that. So we need to restore that, and that's why the New Deal for Working People advocated sectoral collective bargaining in every sector of the economy. Now, shortly before the election, the Labour Party said that it would introduce collective bargaining in the adult social care section. And the bill actually provides for a negotiating body in adult social care and for school support staff. Quite why they've chosen those two sectors instead of sectors which were even more needy, like agriculture and hospitality, it's hard to say. Maybe some particular unions had a bit of leverage over that. But what's important to know is this. One, there is no mechanism in this bill by which sectoral collective bargaining can be introduced by law in any sector of the economy, not in adult social care or school support staff or any other sector of the economy. And number two, in relation to those negotiating bodies, when you analyse it, when you go through these sections line by line, they are not proposing collective bargaining. Why aren't they proposing collective bargaining? Well, several reasons. One is that the bill actually says so. It says the process and the outcome of the negotiating bodies will not be collective bargaining or collective agreements as defined in the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act 1992, section 178. Will not be. So as a matter of law, they won't constitute collective bargaining and collective agreements. That would be all right if the reality was that they amounted to collective bargaining. But they don't. They're not collective bargaining in the sense that any trade unionist or any human resource manager or any representative of the International Labour Organization would understand. We all understand collective bargaining as the two sides getting together, almost invariably in equal numbers, deciding what it is they're going to negotiate, then negotiating that, reaching an agreement, which agreement will then be enforced on all the workers and, if it's sectoral collective bargaining, all the employers who are party to the agreement. But the bill in relation to adult social care and school support staff doesn't do that. It says what subjects the negotiating body is allowed to negotiate, and there's 4 in relation to each one of them. And in relation to the school support staff, the two sides are not even allowed to discuss items which fall within the 4 specified in the bill without the prior permission of the Minister of State. Now, that's not collective bargaining. Other problems as well. The minister is allowed to choose or to identify the categories from which the chair of the negotiating body must be selected, and the categories from which the chair shall not be selected. The chair must not be either an employer's rep or a worker's rep. There's no provision for equality of numbers at the negotiating table, and the bill makes provision for third parties to be represented. In adult social care, the third parties can't vote. For some reason, for school support staff, the third parties can vote. But who the hell are these third parties? Has anybody in this room been in collective negotiations where you have third parties appointed by the government to sit in on the negotiations and participate in the discussions? It's unheard of. That is not collective bargaining. Collective bargaining, equal numbers from both sides and nobody else in the room. They determine who chairs it, what the subject matter is that they want to discuss, and so on. So it's not proper collective bargaining. I've put down, I think, 27 amendments to try and make it into collective bargaining. The minister tells me that the Labour Party is not going to support any of them. Anyway, nevertheless, I'll make a speech about it. So I think that's enough probably for be going on with the collective bargaining. Let me just mention right to strike. I see the president's getting a bit agitated now. Forgive me. But just to say on the right to strike, we have to be grateful, of course, that the bill gets rid of the strikes minimum service legislation, and it gets rid of most of the Trade Union Act of 2016, and it makes certain changes to balloting and so on, and it will get rid of the 40% threshold when they introduce electronic balloting. That's all to be welcomed. But what it doesn't do is sweep away the real problems for trade unions who need to resort to industrial action, and those are the problems introduced by the anti-union laws of Thatcher and Major between 1982 and 1992. That's what imposes the restrictions on trade unions. We haven't got time to go through them all, but the most important one of all is the absolute ban on all forms of sympathy industrial action. This bill simply leaves all that in place. And that's why I criticise it, because it's not restoring what we need, power, rather than giving us a few more rights for the lawyers to argue over. Thanks for listening for so long.